It was in the starving times, in a north country, towards the end of winter, when for most people the harvest feast had dwindled into scraps for survival. Only a few super thrifty or super ruthless souls had managed to accumulate sufficient stores they could live in equal luxury throughout the year. Most people, either because they knew no better or because they knew it was the best way to be, accepted nature's imperative to shut up shop for a while, take a breather, stop working altogether, rest their bodies, fast and clean out their lower intestines. So they huddled together in their houses to keep their bodies warm. They sang songs, told each other stories to keep their spirits bright, or they simply sat and they listened to the silence of the snow, or the risky crackle of the frost and the ice gripping the earth in its demanding embrace as the north wind howled its approval. And they waited philosophically for the spring to follow the winter, as surely as one honest smile can make you feel friends with the whole world. Of course, there were always some people who didn't have a particular home to huddle up in. By choice or circumstance, there were always some people who just took the winter in their stride, and they found food and shelter and company wherever it was offered. And if it wasn't offered, well, they either survived or they didn't survive. And this was the way of the world. People lived and people died as surely as spring follows winter, and one honest smile can make you feel like this is exactly how life needs to be. And there was a farm labourer called Joss with a very high forehead. That was his name, that's what he was known as. He didn't know any other name, but that name was real enough for him to know if he was being talked to or if he was being talked about. And Joss was an orphan. He was raised in an orphanage in the city. Having a mother and father to Joss was a nice enough fairy tale, but it didn't have much to do with his happiness or his unhappiness. And Joss was happy enough to be left alone in peace to enjoy his own thoughts and to marvel at how peaceful his own thoughts seemed compared to all that rushing around going on outside. Of course, it made him unhappy to see all this rushing around going on outside, and people getting so upset and so angry about what, after all, didn't usually break a limb or cost much more than a little time or effort to repair. Joss didn't like the city. As soon as he was old enough to look the owner of the orphanage in the eye and tell him, well, I'm not getting enough food to eat, he knew he was old enough to take care of himself. So he left the orphanage, he left the city, and he went to live in the country where people didn't rush around so much, especially when it was muddy. And he found himself a job on a farm, and with his first week's wages, he bought himself a nice shovel. So now he was known as Joss with a shovel and a very high forehead, which was fine by Joss because he knew he was a good shoveler. And he was never short of work, especially in the shoveling season, or in the digging season, planting season, growing season, harvest. But come January the 1st in the starving times, there was no work to be got for people like Joss, because in those days, not many people shoveled snow. In fact, to many people, shoveling snow was seen as the ultimate gesture of futility. Wasting your time, well, you may as well go and shovel snow for the rest of your life, or rake leaves. So come January the 1st in the starving times, Joss found food, shelter and company wherever it was offered. And if it wasn't offered, well, he just kept moving, because he knew if he stopped moving for any length of time in this weather, he may never move again. Sometimes he even moved around in circles just for a change of pace and perspective. Better to move around in circles, he'd tell himself, than be frozen dead in a straight line. And he'd chew on dried up pepper leaves he'd saved over from the harvest to keep his eyes and his mind mint fresh. Anyway, Joss is walking through the woods one day when he hears music echoing off the icicles, crenulating the crusty air, percolating through his skullcap and his earmuffs. And he peers out through frosted eyelashes, and up ahead in a clearing he can see this man dressed in rags and tatters playing a squeeze box, with no shoes and socks on, but his toes are bright and pink. They're not blue because his feet are scarcely touching the ground for more than a few seconds at a time as he dances around in a cloud of his own breath. And he's got long shaggy hair and a long shaggy beard, and his blue eyes are twinkling with the inner amusement of a being from another planet who knows how invulnerable he is to the trials and the tribulations of this planet. And the two men see each other and they smile and they wave, and Joss asks the squeeze box player in which direction he's travelling. Well, the squeeze box player gives a little jig in every direction as if to say, well, it's all the same to me, you choose and I'll come with you. So they travel on together, and the world is a warmer and a brighter place for it. But they haven't gone more than a few miles when they come across this man lying dead on the ground, frozen solid in a straight line. He'd obviously stopped moving for too long, sat down to rest near this gorse bush, and now you could barely tell where the gorse bush began and the man ended, had it not been for his shiny new boots, with the silver buckles twinkling in the icy glare. Nice boots, eh? Nice boots, says the squeeze box player. Be ashamed to waste them boots. So he kneels down and he unbuckles them and he tries to pull them off, but the feet are frozen solid inside. Well, he thinks for a minute. Then he asks Joss if he can borrow his shovel. Well, Joss shakes his head, because he knows you're not going to dig a grave in this ground's too hard. But the squeeze box player has no intention of digging a grave. He takes the shovel and he lifts it high above his head and he chops off the first foot. He chops off the second foot. And Joss can barely believe his eyes. The dead man's feet split off at the ankles like candy snap-logs. And then the squeeze box player picks up the boots by the buckles, with the feet still inside, and he pops them in his backsack. Then he hands Joss the shovel back. And Joss can't help thinking that this shovel should be all covered in blood, but there's no blood anyway. Suddenly the world seems an utterly bloodless place. Black and white. The black is the tip of his nose, and everything else is white. Anyway, the two travel on together for the rest of the day and half the night till they come to this farm with a lamp still lit in the kitchen. So they knock on the door. And a servant girl answers the door, and she sees these two cold, hungry bodies shivering, but with spirits obviously as warm and bright as a first kiss on a summer's day. So without hesitation, she invites them inside to get warm and rest for a few hours. But she warns them not to sing or play the squeeze box, because that would wake her master, who's a bit of a miser and a misery guts. And he will undoubtedly turn them away, because he treats his animals better than he treats people. And she shows him into the kitchen, with the lamp still lit and these three cows are merrily nibbling away on a tablecloth in front of a big blazing fire. See what I mean? She says, I have to sleep upstairs in the attic, wrapped in an old carpet. But what can a body do in the starving times? Well, you can stay here for a few hours, rest, get warm. I'll wake you up at first light before the master rises. But I warn you, be very, very careful of these cows, because they're very spoiled. Especially that big one there with the light brown spots. She'll undoubtedly try to nuzzle you in the middle of the night. She might even try to nibble your ear off. Then she gave the two men some bread and cheese and retired to her attic in her old carpet. Well, Joss devours his bread and cheese before the squeeze box player's got time to put his squeeze box down. Then he toasts his toes for a few minutes in front of the fire. Then he falls into a deep sleep. The squeeze box player decides this is the perfect opportunity to release his new boots. So he thaws them in front of the fire till the feet slip easily out. Then he puts the new boots on and he tosses the feet to the cows to give them something to nibble and gnaw on, so they won't bother him in the middle of the night. Then he eats his bread and cheese and he falls into a deep sleep. But even before first light, at the last morning shade of night, before the first icicle has begun to weep, the squeeze box player is already up and out with his squeeze box, in the fields, helping the new day revive and celebrate itself, as was his wont. Meanwhile, Joss is still in a deep sleep when the servant girl comes downstairs to wake up her two guests. But there's only one guest there. And then she sees this pair of human feet, and that big cow with the light brown spots is merrily nibbling away on an ankle bone. And she starts to scream hysterically, and the master comes running downstairs, still in his nightie, and she whispers in his ear what his cow's done. She's eaten the squeeze box player. She's even eaten his squeeze box. And before Joss has barely had time to open his eyes, never mind have a good stretch, the old farmer with the grey hair still in his nightie is kneeling down in front of him, stuffing gold coins into his pockets. And he's handing him a big sack of all kinds of food, and he's begging him not to breathe a word of what happened there tonight. Well, Joss has got absolutely no idea what happened there tonight, so he gives his word. And then the farmer bundles him out the front door before he's even had time to thank the servant girl and hope she doesn't get into trouble. So anyway, he's wandering dazedly down the road with all that money jingling in his pockets, and he's checking out the food in his big sack, and when he realises he's forgotten his shovel. And then he wonders what happened to the squeeze box player. Till suddenly he hears music echoing off the icicles, crenulating across the air, percolating through his skull cap and his earmuffs. And he peers out through newly frosting eyelashes, and up in the clearing ahead he can see the squeeze box player dancing around in a cloud of his own breath, with no shoes and socks on, because those new boots pinched his toes, and he couldn't possibly sing and dance and be happy if his toes were being pinched. And Joss shows the squeeze-box blade all the money and the food that the old farmer has given him, and they both decided that servant girl was a little unkind to call her master a miser and a misery guts. He was undoubtedly a very generous soul, and they should sing a song to celebrate his kindness. So they do, and they travel on to the nearest town, where they rent a nice room at the inn, and that's where they stay for the rest of the starving times, warm and cosy and well fed. And by the end of March, Joss has still got enough money left. He can buy himself a new shovel and a hammer to expand his labouring opportunities, because he's quite ambitious in his own way. And he persuades the squeeze-box player to buy himself a new suit of clothes. But by April, the squeeze-box player is still dancing around in rags and tatters, because that new suit of clothes pinched his body, and he couldn't possibly sing and dance and be happy if his body was being pinched. And I'm not sure those two men realised how lucky they were, because that winter went into legend as the coldest winter since time began. It was so cold, many people said, it could freeze the feet of a grown man's body. There was once a little piece of cloud who wanted to do something very special. So she went to the guiding star, and the guiding star told her she was already very special, but if she wanted to do something else very special, maybe she should go down to the earth for a while and live as a human being, which was very different than being a piece of cloud. Though it wasn't any more special. Sometimes things that look different can seem more special, but they're not really. Anyway, first she had to get the blessing of the sun and the moon, because without the sun and the moon there wouldn't be anything neither different nor the same nor special at all. So she did. Then she hopped on the next storm cloud, and it was dark and wet and a little bit scary, and she had to hold on tight as the thunder crashed all around her and the lightning scorched her wisps. But she remembered what the guiding star had told her, and she concentrated very, very hard on what it would feel like to drift too far away from the sun. And she could feel her body getting heavier and heavier and heavier, till finally she turned into a raindrop, and she started falling down to the earth, and she's falling and falling. She feels like she's going to smash apart when she hits the ground, but she remembers what the guiding star told her, and she concentrates very, very hard on what it would feel like not to drift too far away from the moon. And she falls into a little pool of water on the side of a mountain. And at that same moment, two human beings who are hiking up the mountain stop to drink at the pool, and they drink up the little piece of cloud. And it's dark again and wet and a little bit scary, and she can hear these strange thumping sounds she's never heard before, and these strange things begin to grow out of her sides, out of her top, out of her bottom. But just when she's getting used to it and starting to feel fairly comfortable, she starts falling again, and she's falling, and it's dark and wet and a little bit scary. Then suddenly there's a blinding flash of light, like the sun and the moon all roll into one, and the little piece of cloud is born as a baby. And the two human beings who had drunk her from the same pool of water call the baby Tumula, which in sky language means little piece of cloud. And Tumula grows up to be a very happy and very beautiful girl. But one day she decides she wants to do something very special. So she goes to the two human beings who had drunk her from the same pool of water, and they tell her that she's already very, very special. But if she wants to do something else very special, perhaps she should imagine that she's not a little girl at all. She's a raindrop. And if she concentrates very, very hard on what it would feel like to fly up to the sun, she'll evaporate into the sky. And if she concentrates very, very, very hard on what it would feel like to float past the moon on a star-filled night, she'll turn into a little piece of cloud. And she does. And she's very happy. And she's very, 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 very special. This rabbit was walking through the woods when he sees this clot of blood lying on the ground in the middle of the trail. This blood blister gives it a little kick, it rolls away. It gives it another little kick, it rolls away again. And he starts dribbling with it, gives it a backflip, front flip, bounces it on his head. And gradually, This blood ball is beginning to change shape already. It's looking more like an oval extended belly button than a blood ball. Then it starts to grow tiny arms, tiny legs, a head, eyes, ears, nose, mouth, till finally the rabbit realizes he's kicking around a little boy. So he stops immediately. And the little boy looks up at him and smiles. And the rabbit boy takes him by the hand and leads him home to meet his wife, Mrs. Rabbit. And they both like the little boy so much they decide to raise him as their own child. And they dress him in a magnificent red buckskin jacket decorated with porcupine quills. And they all live very happily together for many, many years, till the little boy has grown into a young man. Then one day the rabbits decide it's time to tell him the truth. He's not a rabbit at all, he's a human being. And though they love him very much and they'll miss him very much, perhaps it's time for him to go and meet other human beings. So they pack him a nice carrot lunch and they send him on his way to find the nearest human village. And at this time, a long time ago, when the world as we now know it was only half finished, there was only one human village in the whole world, and he soon found it. And he looked so handsome in his magnificent red buckskin jacket with the porcupine quills, which somehow had grown at the same time he had, so it still fitted him perfectly. And he behaved so friendly and smiled so much that villagers welcomed him with open arms. And he found himself a job as a water carrier. And every day he'd tell stories in the park, even if nobody was listening. Especially funny stories about rabbits, which is why they called him Rabbit Boy. Or about his dreams, especially his dreams of flying up into the sky to meet with his friend, the sun, and they play games together. Kiss the raindrop, kick the cumulus. And sometimes Rabbit Boy would even beat the sun. And the wise people in the village were beginning to realize that this young man had very, very special talents. And eventually, of course, a beautiful young woman in the village, not that there were any ugly young women, but this particular beautiful young woman fell in love with Rabbit Boy, and she wanted to marry him, and he wanted to marry her. But there was one man in the village, IKEY-MO, the village chef, who did not like Rabbit Boy at all. He hated Rabbit Boy, even more than he hated somebody else's cooking. And he was jealous because he too wanted to marry this young woman. And he realized there were several other young men in the village who also didn't like Rabbit Boy because nothing ever seemed to ruffle his feathers. So one day he persuaded these young men to wait in ambush and attack Rabbit Boy. So they did. But Rabbit Boy thinks they want to play, so he starts wrestling with them and he starts beating them. So IKEY-MO brings out his magic hula hoop and he throws it over Rabbit Boy, presuming this will render him helpless. But Rabbit Boy's magic is far more powerful than IKEY-MO's hula hoop. It doesn't affect him, but he still thinks everybody wants to play, so he pretends it does. Then IKEY-MO tells the young men to tie Rabbit Boy to a tree, chop him into pieces, and they'll put him in a soup that night. So they tie him to a tree, and by now Rabbit Boy is beginning to think maybe these people are serious, but still he does not resist. He simply requests that first he may sing his death song. So Death will be expecting him and have his room ready. IKEY-MO agrees, so Rabbit Boy sings his death song in rabbit language. Hey, hey, ho, hey, hey, oh, son, here I come. Don't be glum, we're gonna have some fun. That's roughly translated. And then they chop him into pieces and they put him in a soup. But that night, as the villagers gather round to eat their dinner, there's a big storm and a huge black cloud covers the moon. And then suddenly a shaft of sunlight pierces through the cloud, shoots down to the ground and lands right in the middle of the semicircle. And the villagers can see the chunks of meat jumping out of the pot, and they reform into a human being, Rabbit Boy. And Rabbit Boy begins to climb up the shaft of sunlight into the sky, disappears behind the cloud. And the young men who chopped him into pieces were very afraid, and they admit what they've done. And IKEY-MO admits what he's done, but he doesn't regret it because he says that Rabbit Boy is the evil one. And the wise people in the village decide there's no point trying to punish these men because Rabbit Boy's magic is powerful enough to take care of itself. And sure enough, a few days later, Rabbit Boy turns up back at the village looking very fit and tanned and ready to get married. But IKEY-MO still insists that Rabbit Boy is the evil one. And the village should be very thankful that IKEY-MO's powers are just as great. And to prove it, he tells the men to tie him to a tree, chop him into pieces and put him in a soup. But first they have to let him sing his death song because IKEY-MO is convinced that the secret of Rabbit Boy's trick was the incantation. And he's convinced he can remember it verbatim, word for word. But rabbit language is very subtle and very tricky. And not only does he get all the words wrong, instead of singing to the sun, he sings to the moon. Oh, moon, very soon I'll be dead, I'll meet my doom. And then they roughly translate, then they chop him into pieces and they put him in a soup, and that night they eat him up, and IKEY-MO is never seen again. But many people believe his spirit lives on, if not in the hearts, in the mouths and in the bellies of very greedy and impatient people. Only now his name has been changed to indigestion. In the beginning, about 10 or 15 billion years ago, there was a very big bang which appeared out of nowhere. For the next 6 or 7 billion years, it simply reverberated dispassionately amongst itself with no particular dimension. So gradually, over the next 1 or 2 billion years, several of its spatial echoes began to evolve into very distinct blobs of sound. And this is the origin of the planets. Over the next 1 or 2 billion years, give or take a cosmic blink, these blobs of hot air and less dispassionate gas let off sufficient steam. They began to cool down and solidify into brothy globules, floating in apparently random configurations on the fringes of eternity, extrapolated from the master composition, drifting further and further and further into spatial autonomy. Till finally, about 1 billion years ago, on one particular celestial soup bowl for no particular reason, microorganisms evolved. Don't ask me how, I'm just telling you what I think I know. Bacteria burst forth, germs germinated, and they knew instinctively they couldn't survive on vichyssoise alone, so they began to eat each other, and the big ones ate the little ones. The little ones ate the weaker ones, till eventually the weaker ones devised all kinds of tricky tactics whereby they could sneak up behind and eat the bigger ones and thus become the stronger ones. And meanwhile, the smaller ones are devising all kinds of ingenious disguises to make themselves look like highly indigestible matter so they won't get eaten by the stronger ones. And meanwhile, all the really indigestible matter, dumped after dinner, sloughed off after streamlining bacterial baselines, is sloshing down to the bottom of the ocean, where it's coalescing as what we now know as mud. And this is the origin of the Earth. And meanwhile, life is just getting cooler and cooler and denser, and the thicker it gets, the more it breeds, and the more it breeds, the more space it needs. So it begins to push all this mud up to the surface of the ocean. And the more it breeds, the more food it needs, so the more it needs to eat of itself, and nobody wants to get eaten if they can avoid it. So everybody is devising all kinds of tricky tactics and ingenious disguises, and this is the origin of the species. Till finally life underwater becomes so demanding and complicated, it begins to slosh up onto the Earth's surface as indissoluble slime. And meanwhile, all that mutating mud poop, the Earth, inspired by its deepest memory of what it means to be alive, is sprouting forth all kinds of highly digestible matter, so the slime need no longer eat of itself, it may eat of the Earth. And the Earth is so delighted to be thus used and appreciated, it begins to sprout forth all kinds of fruits and vegetables, thus tempting the slime further and further inland to make sure it's not missing anything delicious, for which purpose it needs to develop tracted underbellies and legs. And this is the origin of reptiles. Till one morning, an ancient iguana realizes the only way she can get to those bananas on top of that banana tree is to turn herself into a monkey, so she does. And this is the origin of primates. Then one afternoon, a hairy ape, while reaching for a pineapple in a nearby pineapple tree, misses his foot and slips, falls to the ground, breaks both his legs. By the time he's healed, 2 billion years later, his arms have shrunk through lack of use. And he's decided he's not meant to hang around in trees anymore. Besides, by now, he's found this very handy hole in a big rock, which keeps him warm and dry and safe from prowling dinosaurs. So now, if he can only figure out how to bring his food closer to home, he won't have to go tramping through that messy, smelly jungle ever again. So he digs deep into his deepest memory of how food originally originated. And he begins to dump all his indigestible matter in one place in his front yard. And this is the origin of the compost pile. And sure enough, it sprouts forth all kinds of fruits and vegetables, and this is the origin of local organic gardening. Then one early evening, the farmer is moping through his weeds in his backyard when he stubs his toe on a rock, and he gets so upset and angry, he picks the rock up, he flings it against another rock, and the flying sparks set light to some dried up leaves, and this is the origin of fire, which will keep him warm, even in the winter, so he doesn't need all this unsightly hair anymore. And this is the origin of razor blades. And with the fire, he can now charbroil, fry, roast, bake some of the less indigestible matter. And this is the origin of gourmet cuisine. Till finally we invent the wheel, so we can carry big rocks and big logs wherever we like, all over the place, so we can build our houses wherever we like to our own specifications and not be at the whim or the mercy of nature anymore. And this is the origin of civilization as we now know it, as far as I know.